newly elected Nelson Mandela Bay Mayor, Ebrahim Fakir, has vowed to intensify the fight against violence and crime in the Eastern Cape Metro. The former council speaker was elected yesterday evening after the DA's Retief Odendaal was ousted in a motion of no confidence.
Reported on is, for example, is that the fact that from the 1st of January this year till last week, we had just over 90 murders, gang-related murders, in the northern areas alone. Then, 2 months ago, New Brighton was, for example, declared the murder capital of the Eastern Cape. So we've got a serious crime issue in our metro.
Now, the new mayor says he also plans to improve service delivery in the area.
I'm meeting an expert on Monday evening, where we've got the electricity mitigation meeting as such, and we do have a strategy in place already to mitigate the electricity crisis. And by, let's say, by Wednesday, Thursday, we'll be able to elaborate on it more.
Now, for more on Ebrahim Fakir's election as Executive Mayor of Nelson Mandela Bay Metro and the future of coalition governance at local government, we're joined now by political analyst Ebrahim Fakir. A very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. There's been a changing of the guard, so to speak, in the Nelson Mandela Bay. Of course, this is a council which has been associated with below-average service delivery, political mayhem, finger-pointing, and a lot of instability. What's your take on the latest moves?
It's not surprising. It's following hot on the heels of Johannesburg and Tshwane and soon to be perhaps Ekurhuleni. But in the previous administration, the Nelson Mandela Bay led the way. It led the way in the sense that you had change of mayors, sometimes from within the same party, people within the same party working against each other, undermining each other. Then you have brinkmanship between the different parties, brinkmanship within the parties, opportunism. And a city like Johannesburg, in contradistinction in this particular administration, has had so far a new mayor every 3 months. Now, no big city, whether Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela Bay, any one of the big metros, which run budgets probably in excess of about 20 billion, they can't afford to have this kind of unstable government with ambiguous and ambivalent institutions which have no mandate around what they are meant to do. And when you have a political administrative interface, management interface, which is broken down to the extent that it has, and is so tightly tied to the changing political fortunes, the administration, the operations, the management of council services actually takes a back seat. Ordinarily, that should not be the case. You can have a changeover in the political guard. You will have different new oversight arrangements probably. You might have new accountability arrangements, but that's besides the point. The general operations should continue because you hire an administration, you have operations, you have managers, you have officials, technocrats, bureaucrats who are meant to carry out this, but those are so closely tied to the political class that when there's a change over there, everything else is held to ransom. That's the first general problem. Second general problem is what you have here is a case of political parties which are completely unrepresentative and unresponsive to public concerns. So you really have to ask yourself, if these people are going into public institutions on the basis of a mandate that they got in an election, are they actually true to that mandate? The question is, or the answer in my view, shortly, has to be no. They are unresponsive to what their constituencies and constituents want. For example, this new mayor talks about gang violence, criminal violence, as if this is a new problem. And as if this person was never a part of the political establishment. So was crime and political violence not an issue when he was an ordinary councillor or a speaker of council?
Yeah. I mean, with this shake-up in the municipality's executive, essentially led by the ANC-EFF coalition, are we likely to see the parties have perhaps more power when it comes to making executive decisions in the city, despite the Northern Alliance's party, Gary van Niekerk, being the mayor? Is there a chance he'll be at the mercy of the ANC and the EFF?
Of course he will be. Look at what happened at the last mayor, who I think survived 2 months in Johannesburg, who was also from in inverted commas, minority party. And here when we talk about minority, I'm using the word advisedly. This is a minuscule minority. It's actually a minority of a minority. These are parties which represent less than a percent of the actual electorate. They are holding senior executive office. Now, look, be that as it may, this is how the cookie crumbles. They were elected on a procedurally correct way. Never mind the fact that, institutions and processes are manipulated and so on. But in effect, what you have is you have the tail wagging the dog. And now the dog is actually saying, we've put someone in a position. We can wag this tail the way we feel like. So the smaller parties think, we're the tail, but we'll wag the dog because we will be able to hold them to ransom because they're in need of us. And what Johannesburg showed, and will probably be repeated in Nelson Mandela Bay, is you're actually at the mercy of the larger parties who've put you there as an instrument, as a front, as a tool, because they need to leverage within themselves, the larger parties that is, what kind of goodies are we prepared to give up and give out in other parts of the country where we might firstly need the party, and secondly, what positions can we get? Thirdly, they will have to consider how are we going to construct this working relationship when the 2024 elections comes around and we need to bargain away positions for provincial cabinet positions at provincial level and also nationally. How are we going to accommodate each other? And what this is going to show up over time is fractions within the different parties, because it's no secret there are portions of the ANC which does not in fact want to work with the EFF, and dare I say there are portions of the EFF which don't necessarily want to work with the ANC. Now both those parties respectively have to respond to their voters and respond to their own members to say, if the EFF claims to be an alternative political party, it's actually not. It's just an alternative political vehicle to achieve the same destination that they could not achieve inside the ANC. The ANC, for its part, has to start explaining away why it expelled these fellows in the first place.
Yeah, and in those efforts to try and construct this relationship, just this week, we heard Deputy President Paul Mashatile speaking about a national dialogue on coalitions being on the cards, possibly within the next 2 months or so, on how the party is going to lead coalitions and ultimately drafting this legislation. At the moment, the agreements for coalitions are not made public so that ordinary citizens are able to perhaps hold politicians accountable to whatever they initially agreed upon in that agreement. How crucial will regulating coalitions be, especially as we head to elections next year?
Well, the thing about regulation, any kind of regulation, is that it can be boon or bust. Let me give you this example. In a case where you've had a clear majority of a government, where you've had no accommodations amongst fractions of different political parties accommodating each other, and if in that instance, you are unable to have any degree of oversight, and because there's weak oversight, there's very low accountability levels. And if you've had such impunity where there is a party in a clear majority, why would you think that if you're accommodating fractions and fractious fractions of political parties with each other, that you will suddenly have better accountability because you have better regulation? As I say, regulation can be boon or bust. And in many instances, given the political culture of impunity in this instance, you are likely to have bust, number one. Number two, you regulate coalitions. It depends how prudently you regulate. If you create thresholds, for example, and say only if you achieve X number of votes are you entitled to hold executive office. Not to be in council, because everyone who is elected and gets the votes must be in council. But you must achieve a certain threshold to hold executive office. That's one way. The second way is to say, yes, make it public and so on. But let me put it to you this way. won't you in some instances be forcing parties to work together who might not have an appetite to do so? And then what happens is once they are in government, they are obstructionists, they play games, there's brinkmanship, and the one consistently undermines the other because they want to show them up ahead of the next election. So what we need is both a regulatory intervention, but we have to have a greater degree of maturity amongst the political players. The only people who can force that maturity are voters, and voters have to punish the politicians who behave badly in office.
Very well. Thank you so much. Thanks for weighing in on this discussion.